Okay, I'm tied with Dan. I'd like to start by thanking the conference organizers for inviting me to speak on the important issue of critical materials, the U.S. government perspective on this issue, and policy initiatives to improve supply chain security and resilience. Critical material issues are fundamentally supply chain issues. A secure supply of any particular material depends on the entire material flow, from the source of the materials to the manufacture of advanced technologies. Secure sourcing of critical minerals and the materials produced from them has been a recurring problem for decades, but has recently achieved increased visibility and a sense of urgency among governments whose economic and national security interests depend on imported raw materials. This seems unlikely to change. The pace of technological development, the advancements in material science that continue to identify the unique characteristics of individual elements and combinations of elements is opening up exciting new applications for an increasingly diverse set of materials and for the volumes of these materials that are unprecedented in human history. As director of the National Minerals Information Center at the U.S. Geological Survey for the past 5 years, I've had a front row seat to observe the recent evolution of this issue. Our ability to evaluate import reliance, mineral criticality, and security of critical material supply chains relies in large measure on the data collected and published by the USGS. Over the past 2 years, several important policy initiatives have been set in motion by the U.S. government with the clear imperative that we identify strategic vulnerabilities in critical mineral and material supply chains, and that we act to develop and implement strategies to mitigate such vulnerabilities. I will briefly discuss a number of these initiatives, in turn, starting at the beginning of the supply chain and moving forward. First, on December 20, 2017, President Trump signed Executive Order 13817, a federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals, initiating a whole-of-government response through an interagency process. The executive order specifically identified import reliance as a source of strategic vulnerabilities. The critical minerals list developed in response to the executive order, which identified 35 minerals or mineral groups, is broad, reflecting the broad interests of multiple U.S. government agencies, and was published in final form in the Federal Register on May 18, 2018. The report in response to the executive order was released by the U.S. Department of Commerce on June 4, 2019. The federal strategy recommends a multifaceted effort that captures, through 6 calls to action, several important and recurring themes. The first is the importance of innovation and R&D to improve mineral processing efficiencies, including and especially byproduct minerals, identify substitutes, enable and facilitate recycling, and sourcing critical materials from unconventional sources. This acknowledges that not all our demand requirements need come from new primary mines. Innovation and R&D are strengths of the U.S. and our allied partners that we can and should leverage. That said, the scale of material demand that is anticipated, for example, for the transformation of the transportation sector to electric vehicles, means that we will not recycle our way out of our supply problems. New primary production will clearly be required. The second theme is the inherent supply chain nature of the critical materials problem. A case in point, rare earth element mining and concentrate production at the Mountain Pass operation in California has resumed and is proceeding at scale. However, due to the lack of downstream capability for cracking, leaching, and separation, the concentrate is being shipped to China for separation and further processing. The strategic vulnerability in this instance has not been mitigated. It has simply migrated down the supply chain. This highlights the fact that this is not simply a problem of mining and concentrate production capacity. That is true for many of the minerals on the U.S. critical minerals list, and is an indication that these supply chain vulnerabilities must be addressed by mineral-specific mitigation strategies. And we need to recognize that for many of the materials, there are multiple vulnerabilities in the supply chain. These vulnerabilities propagate down the entire supply chain to and through manufacturing of components and systems that make up products that are essential to our economic and national security interests. This is highlighted in the U.S. Department of Defense report assessing and strengthening the manufacturing and defense industrial base and supply chain resiliency of the United States, issued in response to Executive Order 13086. This report highlights the outsourcing of entire supply chains and the competitive pressures faced, in particular, by small and medium-sized manufacturing firms who are increasingly forced to compete on a playing field which is not level. This results in single sourcing, sole sourcing, and single points of supply chain failure, which are, by definition, strategic vulnerabilities. A third theme, and perhaps of particular interest to this gathering, is the importance of trade with reliable partners. This highlights the observation that import reliance is not equivalent to import vulnerability. Vulnerability is really a function of the material of concern, the source from which it is supplied, and the options that one has for alternate sources of supply. Reliance on imports from Australia, for example, with its top 4 producer status for 8 of the minerals on the U.S. critical minerals list and high potential for many more, is a source of strategic strength, not vulnerability. Security of supply lies in diversity of supply, and reliance on trade with reliable partners has been shown to be an effective mechanism for reducing import reliance to less than 50% of U.S. consumption, the threshold that we use in our critical mineral modeling methodology, when trade flows with reliable partners are netted out in a study published by the USGS in 2018. Thus, when evaluating our options for addressing strategic vulnerabilities, we need to be mindful of the fact that market-based operators in allied countries are subject to the same global economic factors which negatively impact U.S. producers who are competing with state-owned and sponsored enterprises in other countries for global market share. Collective action on the part of like-minded partners is one way to draw these 3 themes together. The U.S. State Department's Energy Resource Governance Initiative, which focuses on the anticipated demand for energy resource minerals for renewable energy, electric vehicles, and battery storage, is an example of this approach. Fostering collaborative research and development opportunities, focusing attention on mining best practices, and insisting that global suppliers adhere to responsible and sustainable mining, processing, and recycling processes are ways of leveling the playing field, which will increase the confidence of investors, diversify supply away from bad actors, and promote integrated and resilient supply chains. Another recent U.S. government initiative focused on the rare earth supply chain is captured in a series of presidential determinations signed on July 22, 2019. These memoranda from the President to the Secretary of Defense identify domestic capacities for light and heavy rare earth separation, rare earth metal and alloy production, and neodymium iron boron and samarium cobalt rare earth permanent magnets as essential to the U.S. national defense. This authorizes the use of the provisions of the Defense Production Act of 1950 to develop domestic capacity through purchases, purchase commitments, and other investments from mine to magnet. Commitment on the part of concerned governments should be interpreted as signals to the market, private sector producers, and investment communities that we are serious about addressing security of supply issues. There is precedent for the use of Title III authorities under the Defense Production Act to ensure a secure and reliable supply of a critical mineral mining and mineral processing supply chain in the United States. The mining and processing of beryllium and the production of beryllium metal and master alloys in the U.S. is a direct result of such investments and hence illustrates the efficacy of this approach. Language in the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act highlights this commitment as it relates to the procurement of strategic minerals by defense contractors for the U.S. military. Section 891 of the fiscal year 2019 NDAA specifically prohibits sourcing of rare earth permanent magnets, tungsten metal powders, and tungsten metal alloys from North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. While certain exceptions are allowed, this is a clear mechanism for ensuring that defense contractors recognize the importance of security of supply issues as part of their business model. The challenge for governments in this construct is to identify ways to facilitate the success of private sector producers as these constraints are implemented. The implementation of the U.S. whole-of-government strategy to ensure secure and reliable supply of critical minerals is being led by various executive branch agencies with coordination and monitoring of progress by the Critical Minerals Subcommittee under the National Science and Technology Council in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. While all the initiatives are interagency efforts, we have identified specific executive branch agencies to lead the 6 calls of action in the strategy report. Call to Action 1, which focuses on innovation and R&D, is being led by the Department of Energy. Call to Action 2 on industrial-based supply chains is being led by the Department of Defense. Call to Action 3 on trade with reliable partners is being led by the Departments of State and Commerce. Call to Action 4 on improving the understanding of domestic critical mineral potential is being led by the Department of the Interior through the U.S. Geological Survey. Call to Action 5 on improving access to critical minerals on federally managed lands is being led by the Department of Interior through the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of Agriculture through the U.S. Forest Service. And Call to Action 6 on STEM education is being led by the Department of Education and the National Science Foundation. Above all, addressing critical material supply chain vulnerabilities will require sustained focus and effort on the part of governments, the private sector, the academic community, and other stakeholders. It has taken decades for the US and other advanced economies to reach the situation we face today with regard to import reliance and the outsourcing of supply chains. It would be naive and simplistic to assume that we can quickly and easily correct the problems we face. The 2010 rare earth crisis, now nearly 10 years in the rearview mirror, offers an instructive example. Sorry, I lost my place there. Some would say that we have made very little, if any, progress in the 10 years since the last wake-up call on rare earth elements. I disagree. 10 years later, we have mining and concentrate production at scale at Mount Weld and light rare earth separation production at scale in Malaysia, thanks to the efforts of the Japanese government in partnership with a strong private sector partner. We have mining and concentrate production at scale in Mountain Pass in California, one of the world's most demanding environmental regulatory settings, despite the difficulties encountered over the past 10 years. It is worth noting that Mount Weld and Mountain Pass are two of the largest high-grade rare earth deposits in the world. Grade does matter in mining. We need to identify the best deposits for critical minerals globally and support those operators who demonstrate that they have the business, technical, and operational capabilities to succeed. We have promising heavy rare earth mining and processing projects that have been identified, and in the case of the Browns Range in Western Australia, ramping up. Heavy rare earth separation capacity is a clear priority which needs to be addressed, along with additional investments in rare earth metal and metal alloy production, as well as rare earth permanent magnet production. But there are companies which exist with the capability to make this happen. There are similar examples for other critical mineral supply chains. It is past time for all of us to roll up our sleeves and get on with the important work of ensuring secure and reliable supply of critical minerals and materials. Thank you all for your attention and your interest in this important issue.